Five Nights at Freddy's Secret of the Mimic came out last Friday, and this game has some of the most insane lore we've ever seen in a FNAF game. From reveals about the origins of Fazbear Entertainment to details about Fall Fest, William Afton, and Henry Emily, this new game is packed with interesting things to talk about. In this ultimate guide to Secret of the Mimic's lore, I'm going to go over all the major lore I found in this huge game, as well as how it ties directly to the new and old FNAF story, before tying it all together with the full timeline of the game. Each segment is split into chapters, so feel free to skip around as you like. And obviously, look out for spoilers. This is your last warning. But no more beating around the bush. I'm WitheredCircle, and today, we solve Secret of the Mimic. And let me tell you, this game is a treat. To begin with, let's set the stage. Where and when are we in Secret of the Mimic? Who do we play as? And most importantly, why are we doing this? Well, Secret of the Mimic takes place between 1979 and 1983. I think it's 79, but so far it's up to debate. We play as Arnold, a Fazbear Entertainment employee tasked by dispatch to retrieve the invention of one of the company's former contractors, Edwin Murray. Said creation is the Mimic, an endo designed by Edwin to imitate his son David. We were introduced to Edwin in the Tales from the Pizzaplex books, where he ran a small costume-making business funded by Fazbear with a similar backstory to that of the game. But Secret of the Mimic directly contradicts the books. There's more to it that we'll talk about later, but in this game, we enter Murray's costume manor. This place is massive. While the map size it occupies is quite small, it's an immense facility, stretching underground and occupying a huge amount of space. And we're not the first employee to go here either, as the corpses scattered across the factory make it pretty clear. Anyway, we're informed by dispatch that we need to collect the schematics for Murray's Mimic program and endoskeleton for Fazbear's own use. Well, the factory is separated by doors that require different clearance levels to pass. As the player progresses through the factory, they can collect upgrades to their data diver, a device that allows you to open doors and find new paths in the location. A lot of the game has you traversing through different areas, meeting different animatronics and engaging in puzzles or chase sequences, leading you through different storage areas, until you gain a high enough clearance to access Edwin Murray's private office. We start with a pretty simple task. Upgrade your data diver further and further. First, we have to run away from Jackie, the clown animatronic, which leads us to the Big Top, a circus area with a giant older version of Music Man with weird motion-activated mannequins around him. There's nothing noteworthy in this area, but after this, we progress further, eventually making it to a very cool segment, because one of the mechanics in this game are spring-lock suits. Wearable spring-lock suits. At one point, you're tasked with assembling a pirate springlock suit to enter the theater area, as the system only allows animatronics or suited-up performers into the premises. As we assemble the... Wait a minute, is that the Ruin Scooper? You heard that right, the tool used to prime and assemble the pirate springlock suit in Secret of the Mimic is the same claw we use in Ruin to neutralize the Mimic, in the same room and everything. But obviously it's in much better condition in this game. This makes it pretty clear that the thing we were calling a scooper isn't actually meant to scoop endoskeletons. Its use is to automatically build springlock suits. Proof that Edwin was a lazy bum, seeing as William and Henry could do it by themselves no problem. This scooper appearing is an insane revelation. This means that the Pizzaplex is built on top of the ruins of Murray's costume manor. Looking back, a lot of the layout of Ruin matches up pretty well, so not only does it have the FNAF 6 location under it, but also Murray's. After clearing the theater area, we get to Nurse Dolly's section, where we melt her down and move on to the last big chunk of the game, the build-up to Edwin Murray's office. The segments right before and right after this office area are very interesting, and I want to talk about them. Right after we go over some of the lore we get about Edwin that can be found for the audio players strewn across the factory. In the books, we never get a good explanation of Edwin's backstory. But in The Secret of the Mimic, it's revealed to us that Murray's costume manor was created by Edwin's father, and that Edwin met his future wife Fiona because she worked as a puppeteer there. Eventually, Edwin's dad passed away, and Edwin inherited the factory, partnering with Fazbear Entertainment to help create their characters. We learn that Edwin is oftentimes neglectful of his son David. One day, Fiona leaves the factory, telling Edwin she needs to, quote, help the Fall Fest team. Now, in case you don't know what this means, or why it matters, there's a very simple reason for why it's such a massive bombshell. In the books, Fiona dies in childbirth as David is born. In the games, however, she lives long enough to raise him for a few years before she dies in Fall Fest, meaning that the books are officially debunked. I'll get into more reasons as to why later, but for now, let's focus on Fall Fest. We first saw Fall Fest in Help Wanted in the Curse of Dreadbear DLC, but it was mentioned all the way back in Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator, aka FNAF 6, as Spookfest. This is shown to be an event tracing back to 1970, years before Edwin's time as a manager of Murray's costume manor. This is likely the beginning of Fazbear Entertainment, and where Henry and William met Edwin. Anyway, the reason why I think Fiona dies at Fall Fest is because of one thing that's always tied to any mention of Fall Fest. Fire. In every single iteration of Fall Fest, it's always associated with fire. The Fall Fest posters have fire patterns. In Help Wanted 2, the place lights on fire twice, some of the Fall Fest adjacent mascot suits in ruin, and the books are charred and burnt, etc. My point is that Fiona likely went to help the Fall Fest team, which led to her death when the place burnt down. Edwin even confirms that she's dead in one of the tapes we find later on. But, as we'll see, that's not the end for her. But let's talk about those segments I brought up earlier, shall we? As you approach Murray's private office, you enter a mini boss fight against a Chica costume. Throughout the game, the Mimic changes costumes as it chases you. These changes are random and up to RNG, so it's fresh with every chase. In this fight, in the entire bit leading up to Murray's office, this Chica costume is seen being worn by the Mimic, so it's not actually the Chica animatronic from Freddy's. Once you're through with the needlessly difficult and very poorly optimized Chica segment, you finally get your hands on the Mimic schematics and upload them to your data diver. But you're not done. In fact, you are far from it. After you get the schematics, you realize you're trapped, with no way out than finding a shortcut for the basement. But you're not alone there. What follows is by far one of the scariest sequences in any FNAF game. The Tiger Room. The room is completely dark, with glitchy lights that vaguely signal where you need to go. All the while, you're followed by a ghostly teleporting white tiger, a scaled-up version of David Murray's plushie, as the sounds of children's laughter, screaming, and the Mimic's voice are heard looping on repeat, as images of the tiger flash in the player's view. This isn't the first time we see the tiger either. He appears for a brief moment in the theater area right after equipping the pirate's springlock suit. This last tiger section is quite difficult, but once you're done, you're free to make your way to the security office and upload the Mimic schematics. I made the game sound short, but there's a lot to it, and it personally took me 7 hours to get the normal ending. More about the endings in a bit. Once you're done, you're informed by dispatch to place the data diver in the inventory box, a tool area used to access collectibles. But something's off. The once sarcastic dispatch guy now sounds weird and unnatural. If you choose to place it in anyway, you walk safely to your van and drive off home. Except, you're not safe. Something followed you, and that something is our first look at the bare Mimic endoskeleton in full view. This is a bad ending, the first of 3 endings obtainable in Secret of the Mimic. Let's go over the other 2 and the lore they reveal before we start tying it all together. For the next ending, the parachute ending, instead of placing the data diver in the box, the player must activate the helper computer on the security desk and choose the activate parachute.exe option. This will open an event which will lead the player to the welcome show, the first room we see upon entering Murray's. After a quick boss fight against a now ruined Big Top Music Man, we enter the most bizarre area of the game. Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Or is it? In fact, this is obviously not Freddy's. It's likely an early prototype version of it, as we see unfinished animatronics on the stage, with building materials and multiple drawn curtains. But most strangely of all, we see the Mimic's new form. Remember how I brought up the multiple costumes the Mimic can wear throughout the game? This one is a gross amalgamation of prototype Freddy, Chica, and Bonnie parts. It appears that while Edwin was working on a cheap concept Freddy's location, he left the parts lying around, and allowed the Mimic to wear them. In this underground pizzeria, we find early prototype versions of Spring Bonnie and Fredbear. They look very different to the ones we're used to, and are obviously not the ones used at Fredbear's Family Diner, which is referenced multiple times throughout the game by the way. Anyway, after a long puzzle segment, you escape the prototype Freddy's and move on to Edwin's private house next to the factory. This segment has you collecting 5 tapes that detail Edwin's relationship with David and his wife, all recorded by him on a camera. But there's one specific tape that shows that something is off. Really off. Remember how I said Fiona almost definitely died at Fall Fest? Well, I doubted this for a bit as I played the game. After all, we'd heard her voice on the MCM recordings, and sometimes Murray spoke about her in the present tense. But in this tape, as Edwin talks to her and the camera turns, we see that Edwin isn't talking to Fiona. He's pretending his wife is still alive, using the Mimic to roleplay his insane fantasy. The truth is, by this point in the story, Edwin Murray is out of his mind. This is an extremely unsettling part of the game, and it gets worse. Through the tapes scattered across the costume manor, you see Edwin try to convince himself and the Mimic that it's Fiona, and it all culminates in one thing. After we collect those 5 tapes, we're allowed into a room containing a huge computer. A computer called F10N4. Fiona. And this isn't just any old computer. This is Maxis from Security Breach Ruin, a device designed solely to protect and lock away the Mimic endoskeleton. And it's Fiona. This game is insane. Fiona explains to us that Edwin pretended she was his wife, and that she wants us to deliver a message to him, trying to convince him to complete something called M2. This isn't actually Fiona, it's a strain of the Mimic program imitating her, likely imbued with some kind of agony created by Edwin. If you progress, you're chased by the naked Mimic Endo until it chases you out of the house. Fiona tries to talk to Edwin, but as the player knows, he's been missing for a while. We make it to his private office where we escape the building and go into our van, leaving Fiona behind. But just like in the first ending, our efforts are in vain. The M2 mimic endoskeleton catches up to us and crashes our car. But unlike the bad ending, it doesn't kill us. Instead, it does something very interesting. It steals our data diver, the one with the mimic schematics, and the key to access every part of the costume manor. The mimic slowly walks off back to the manor, and everything fades to black. I think this is the canon ending for reasons I'll get into in the final lore segment, but let's move on to the ending that melted everyone's brain when we got it. The best ending. This ending is only accessible through the New Game Plus option, which gives us a bonus item that we'll need to beat the ending. David's tiger plushie. His favorite character and best friend. Secret of the Mimic isn't a one-layered game, however it might seem. There's tons of collectibles for the player to find and, well, collect, but they actually serve a purpose. On our helper computer, there's a program called moon.exe, a simple yet really weird primitive game that has us playing as something, or someone. The items we find in the factory are transported into the game, and we use them to interact with two characters in particular, Sun and Moon. Sun helps us, while Moon kills us if it catches us. I won't get into the full specifics of it, as I want to do that in another video, but to put it in a few words, this game is really strange, and there's more crying child imagery than I'm comfortable with. You start off in a bedroom, there's a bunch of crying child's toys being mentioned non-stop, and more. But eventually you make it to the end of the game, and it grants you an upgrade to your data diver, the glitched access. In the final big room of the parachute ending, where you need to collect the 5 tapes, there's a series of rooms with glitched doors that you can't enter. Now that moon.exe is complete, you can enter these rooms, find multiple tapes scattered across them, and insert them all into one hub. This opens a vent, which leads you to a recreation of a certain, very familiar room. The FNAF 4 Crying Child's room. It's not one-to-one, but it's extremely similar, because this is David Murray's room. The Mimic enters inside after placing our Tiger Rock plushie on a pedestal, and we lull it to sleep using recordings of Edwin and the real Fiona telling it a bedtime story, just like they used to do with David. The Mimic looks up and says one last thing before deactivating. I love you. All it wanted was love. All it wanted was to feel like Edwin needed it. The game fades to black, and just like that, you've gotten all the endings, the secret of the Mimic. So, let's talk about the elephant in the room. What the hell is going on here? Who are M1 and M2? What's up with the Freddy Fazbear's imagery, and how are Henry and William involved in all this? Well, it's time to explain. To begin with, M1, the code that keeps being mentioned, is the original Mimic code. It's the code that was repurposed into the Fiona machine from the parachute ending, and the one that Edwin shaped into his dead wife. And M2 is the second Mimic code, designed to imitate David after his death. It's not fully finished, but we see it in the best ending where it mimics David and deactivates. This is also the one we face off against in-game, and the one Edwin infused with his rage. Now, about the Fiona AI, this one is really weird. For a long time, we thought Ruin's Max's machine was just AI, but it turns out it's seemingly possessed by some remnant of Fiona, some memory of her embedded in the machine. I personally dislike this idea, and I think it's just a mimic, as we see it flawlessly imitating Dispatch for most of the game, but it's still up to debate. Now, on to the juicy stuff. What does Fazbear Entertainment have to do with all this? Well, like I mentioned earlier, Murray's costume manor is very closely associated with Freddy's, with Fredbear's pizza boxes scattered all over, and multiple Freddy's characters present. It's likely that Henry and William commissioned suits from Edwin Murray during the creation of Fazbear Entertainment, and they used these to create prototypes of the animatronics as we see in the parachute ending. And there's actually direct evidence of this fact. Remember that random Chica segment before Edwin's office? Well, it's not random. While it's placed in a set of office rooms, a really weird space for Chase, it's for a reason. So, where's this Chica costume from? We get our answer in a side room after the initial Chica segment. This suit was commissioned by an establishment called Chica's Party World. Now, to the expert fans in the audience, you probably recognize that name from a very specific game, Sister Location. In the build-up to Sister Location, the 5th mainline FNAF game, we got an assortment of teasers on the Scott Games website to hype up the game. But if you looked into the source code of the website, you'd find several interesting things. One of these is a schedule of when Circus Babies would rent out their funtime characters, and to whom. Obviously, Circus Babies is run and created by William Afton, so he's the one behind this. But anyway, look at one of the companies listed. Chica Party World. In FNAF 6, we find out that Afton made a funtime Chica that somehow ended up in Henry Emily's possession. What does this mean? Well, I think Chica's Party World was an establishment started by Henry before he met William. A simple fast food joint with a 1950s diner vibe, as is implied by Chica's clothes and art style as well as the roller skates she wears. Henry Emily would have made this location back in the 70s before meeting William, and it stayed in operation up until the events of sister location. It's likely Henry then took the Funtime Chica animatronic William rented out to him and used it for Pizza Sim. Chica's Party World was likely how William met Henry and how they got together to create Fazbear Entertainment back in the 1970s. It's actually implied Edwin knew Henry before the beginning of Freddy's, as shown in one of the hidden logs found in-game. Quote, "Fiona, the new spring locks are working well, even with the water damage. They should be ready for the diner soon. I'll just make sure to warn Hen about some of the more odd behaviors they might have." Not only does this confirm that Edwin helped make the springlock suits for Fredbear's family diner, but him calling Henry Hen implies they were friends for a while and that Fiona knew him. I believe MCM was the link between Henry Emily and William Afton, and that it was Edwin that caused everything that happened later on. But that's not all, because William and Henry were the reason MCM closed down. Throughout the game, you can find multiple audio players stuck to walls. These audio players are how we found out about Fiona's fate and how Edwin used the mimic to imitate her. But one of these tapes in particular is very interesting. In it, Edwin shouts at his employees, saying they're all fired, calling them traitors for revealing the company's secrets. It's actually very likely that William Afton, the co-founder of Fazbear, sent spies to figure out how Edwin made the mimic and find the blueprints of the Springlock costumes he made, so he could make them himself. It's likely that he stole this information, which he then used to make the updated Fredbear Spring Bonnie costumes, and later on the Freddy Fazbear Band. So even though those characters were owned by Edwin, after he disappeared, William and Henry could use them for their own purposes. So MCM is very closely tied to Fazbear and ended up collapsing because of them. We also find out that after MCM closed, William himself claimed Edwin's property, meaning that he could have built his house, the FNAF 4 house, on top of the hill we see in the distance, and that the Circus Babies Entertainment and Rentals bunker could be built near the prototype Freddy's under the factory. Now, I want to talk a bit about what happened to David, the son of Edwin Murray, before we move on to talking about the books, some other details, and my full Secret of the Mimic timeline. We all know that David ran out on the road and got hit by a car because of Edwin neglecting him. But what really happened after that? Did he possess the M2 or something else? Well, I think David didn't possess just one thing. I think the pain and tragedy of his death caused his agony to pour all over Murray's costume manor, and the one who created that agony was Edwin. By mourning his family's death and beating the M2 mimic to a pulp, Edwin poured out so much of his and David's pain into the factory that a byproduct was created. Just like Golden Freddy, who's like a manifestation of the tragedies at Freddy Fazbear's, all of the suffering felt by the Murrays became one being: the tiger. This thing is not the mimic. It's very clearly supernatural, as it can teleport and cause you to hallucinate. This tiger entity is David's agony, as proven by it being tied to the best ending and being the final boss fight of the game. Anyway, let's move on. It's time to talk about what this game means for the FNAF continuity debate. For a while, we've debated the canonicity of the FNAF books, and the discussion over the true meaning of Fazbear fights and Tales from the Pizzaplex has been heated. For the past 2 years, it feels like Scott was leaning towards the books being canon to the games, through the introduction of the Mimic, last year's Into the Pit game, and more. I personally believe that Tales and Frights were connected to the game's timeline, but Secret of the Mimic has definitively proved that's not the case. Not only does Fiona survive childbirth in the games, like we discussed earlier, but the backstory of Edwin and his company completely contradicts the books. There's also the M1 and M2 storyline, which goes against the books, where there's only one Mimic Endo. I'll go over more of my thoughts on this some other time, as I plan to make many more videos about this game, but for now, suffice it to say that while I am a bit disappointed, I think this is the right direction for the franchise. Sure, it undermines those books, but it also allows for a cleaner story. But now that we've gone over most of the major important stuff I want to cover, it's time for the true answer to this game. What is happening in Secret of the Mimic? Which ending is canon, and what's the full timeline of this game? Let's find out. I present to you the timeline of Secret of the Mimic. At some point in the mid-20th century, Edwin Murray's father opened Murray's Costume Manor, a factory dedicated to creating mascots for companies that accepted commissions for costumes and robotic components. In the 70s, he died, and his son Edwin took over the business, meeting a puppeteer called Fiona who worked for the company beforehand. They married and had a son called David. But Edwin was extremely focused on his work, often neglecting his family. Around the time of David's birth, he met Henry Emily, an engineer who had commissioned him for a suit meant for a restaurant called Chica's Party World. Edwin agreed, and the two became close friends, helping each other design a new type of mascot technology: the Springlock suit. However, William Afton, Henry's business partner, spoke to Henry about getting Edwin to help them develop the Fredbear and Spring Bonnie costumes, as well as the Freddy Fazbear characters. Edwin developed prototype versions of these mascots, which Henry and William used as a base for their own original designs. These particular ones had much less safe spring locks and were generally worse than Edwin's work. They sent Fazbear employees to MCM to infiltrate the location and steal all of Edwin's work and blueprints, leading to heavy financial issues for the Murrays. Eventually, Edwin's wife Fiona died in the fire at Fall Fest, a costume circus attraction. Heartbroken, Edwin used the Mimic, a secret software he developed, and used it to bring her back, making her essentially a babysitter to David. He tried to convince herself she was real, but as we see in the tapes he scattered across the building, he knew she wasn't. He eventually uploaded her to the F10 and 4 computer and left her in a dark corner of his private house. Eventually, through his own neglect, his son David ran out and got run over. Desperate, he tried creating another Mimic code to put into the same endo, but frustrated, he beat it to a pulp and disappeared. And it's implied he died after this. The Mimic gained some kind of primitive awareness and started laying waste to the factory as it slowly decayed. Eventually, in 1979, William Afton found out about what the Mimic did and how Edwin had managed to bring his family back. Obsessed with the idea of immortality, William informed Dispatch to send our protagonist, Arnold, to the location to retrieve the Mimic code. Arnold succeeded, and even though the Mimic tried to trick him into depositing the data diver, he escaped. However, the Mimic chased after him and killed him, grabbing his diver and making its way back. MCM eventually starts collapsing into the ground, and William gets the surrounding area from Edwin and builds his house over it. The Mimic, trapped in the basement of the building, is unable to escape, but traverses the ruins of MCM as the years go by. Henry and William failed to get the code, but they found the Mimic and likely tried to use it. The Fiona computer was eventually seized by Fazbear and driven away from the building. It could later be used to seal the Mimic under the Pizzaplex, and the rest is history. This is the complete timeline of Secret of the Mimic. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this full explanation of SOTM, and that you learned something new and now have a clear understanding of the lore. I'll be making plenty more detailed videos on this game's lore, but this ultimate guide should be enough for now. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and remember to comment your opinion. That'll be all for now. Bye.